Well, hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining for today's Telos Live Faith in Action webinar. My name is Ryan Pemberton. I serve as Director of Christian Engagement here at Telos. We're very grateful to gather with you all to share some updates from Telos's efforts in the work of peacemaking, and specifically today, some of our faith-based initiatives. As we get started today, as folks are trickling in, we'll take a few minutes to let folks get set up. If you would, feel free to let us know in the chat, where are you joining from today? We always appreciate hearing where our Telos community is represented. I'm joining from Kenmore, Washington today and enjoying a break in the rain. How about you all? See folks represented in Minnesota and DC, Raleigh, North Carolina, some other folks in this Washington. Welcome, very special welcome. Well, thanks so much for sharing again where you're calling in from today. We're very grateful that you're taking this time to be with us. So thank you so much for joining. Well, as we get started, let's take a look at our agenda for today's conversation. And again, feel free to drop your name and where you're calling from in the chat. We always love to hear from you there. So for today's call, we're looking forward to covering a few things, beginning with some Israel-Palestine updates on the ground, as well as the future of Telos trips there. We'll also have some time to share some updates on our Mosaic pastors cohort and to hear some reflections from our recent Ireland and Northern Ireland pilgrimage there at the end of last month. And then we'll conclude our time today with some Q&A. And I will just make a note at the start of today's call that if you have questions as things are being discussed, feel free to drop those into the chat, but we'll hold off until the end to respond to those questions just to make sure we have time to get through our entire program for today. So let's go ahead and begin then today's conversation with some reflections from Greg Khalil, Telos co-founder and president, as well as Jack Saba, Telos former Israel-Palestine program director, on our recent IP trip plans, which, of course, as you all know, were canceled due to the outbreak of war in Iran at the end of the last month and the current state of events on the ground there. And as we begin this conversation, I'd like to acknowledge that we are all feeling heartbroken and overwhelmed with what's been happening. We've been feeling that way, of course, long before the US and Israel's joint attacks on Iran at the end of February, but we feel the limit of words, even as we try to discuss what we're watching unfold. So I'd like to give us all permission to not feel as though we have to have it all together or even have to have the answers. I do think it's worth noting that we are still in the season of Lent. And for those of us who keep this season, Lent reminds us that we live in dark days. We're reminded of our own mortality in Lent. And we're also invited to acknowledge our shortcomings and our own complicity in the violence impacting our global and our local neighbors. But Lent is not merely a time for passive reflection. There are things to be done, even here in the dark. We hope to highlight some of those actions, some of those steps to be taken together today. But to begin, maybe Jack, can we start with you? Would you mind sharing with us what are things like on the ground there in Israel and Palestine right now?
Sure, yeah. Hi, Ryan, and hi, everyone. I see a lot of familiar names and friends. First, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to pay attention to this and take the time out from your busy schedules to have this conversation. Um, it feels lonely here, so I'd say that. But it's difficult to fully describe the constant kind of roller coaster of emotions that you live through on a daily basis in this reality. I'll try to maybe back up to day one, I think, of this war to 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 kind of catch you all on how it feels. It didn't catch us fully by surprise, since the Israelis had been talking about an attack on Iran for about a month and a half, if I remember correctly, like mid-January. there was supposed to be, oh, we're going to attack Iran any day now. And then the US entered negotiations with Iran, and so it kind of got dragged on. And it was, and every week I remember it was feeling like, okay, this weekend it's going to happen, this Friday it's going to happen for about a month. And then about, I would say 9 a.m. on Saturday, February 28th, we received a blaring alert, like an Amber Alert on our phones. And from our experience last summer, last episode of this, that meant that a ballistic missile had been launched towards your area. Now, in reality, this wasn't because a missile was launched at us, but because Israel had actually launched their attack on Iran. And so it was just kind of alerting everyone to say that there would be a response at some point in the next hour, a couple hours. And so you're just kind of on edge once you get that. And even before you're, facing an actual threat, these are alarms to just throw out your whole day and throw you into a whirlwind of anxiety. And you don't know if Iran is going to hit back and at what capacity. So, in our case, my wife and I run a concept store and cafe in Yafa. And Saturdays are, our busy part of the week. They're the weekend where people come out both to shop and spend time at the cafe. So we bought extra food. We have staff on board that's showed up already for the day. Um, and then you get this sudden alert, and so all of a sudden everyone stays indoors, and your whole day and week and whatever's thrown off. And sure enough, within kind of the hour, we had an actual Amber Alert, and then followed by a siren outdoors that signals that a missile is in the air and about to be intercepted. And so you should run for cover, or whether you should hurry to like a bomb shelter or a safe room. And I could talk about the difference between those two different things, and who has them and who they're available to. But that's kind of the start of, now going on a month of constant uncertainty. Schools are out, so kids are at home. I would say most people are either not going to work or working remotely if they can. Um, I put my employees on unpaid leave, so there's, uncertainty of how long um, that's going to happen, how long our kids are going to be out of school, how long our business is supposed to survive without, in this state of war, with people not leaving their house. Can I go on a 25-minute drive errand to do something, to pick something up? Will I get caught in a siren and have to stop at the side of the road and find cover? So, there's all of that, and there's just kind of a mixture of emotions. We're actually also right now in the past week or two, um, having to deal with the news of like the US is gonna attack energy infrastructure in Iran, and so Iran is targeting energy infrastructure in Israel, and so we'll be out of electricity. And there's already been a hit in the north in Haifa's power plant, which caused some shortages of power around the country. Um, yeah, so that's kind of like what life is like. On top of that, there's usually about two or three missiles, sirens, and missile intercepts in the middle of the night, usually around 1 a.m., 4 a.m., and 6 or 7 a.m. So by 9 a.m., as you get up and start your day, you're a walking zombie. Um, and the most frustrating part, I would say, is, if you're a semi-diligent person, just like aware of, and you do some research, you would know that, that the former supreme leader of Iran, that was killed, had actually passed a religious edict saying that barring the development of nuclear weapons, and that all U.S. and objective Israeli security analysts said and confirmed that there was no imminent threat on either US or Israel. And so you're living kind of, you realize you're living at the whims of a couple powerful people that decided that they're just going to throw your life into this chaotic mess with no real end in sight. Um, and and even if it does end at this point, from our experience 6, 7 months ago, last summer, it's like there hasn't been any solution. There won't be a solution even now if they reach some sort of deal, and it just buys you 6, 7, 8 more months before the next round. Um, so so that's just a little bit. I'm trying to throw a lot in there, but I'm happy to take more kind of more specific questions about different elements of life in
Thanks for
this. Yeah.
the overview, Jack, and the sort of summary of just how chaotic life must feel there, how disordered everything is from this war, and yet how people are just trying to still live and get through the day, even moving work online as everything is unsettled. Thanks for that update, Jack. Well, maybe to extend the conversation then to you both, Greg and Jack, for those who have gone on an IP trip with Telos in the past, I'm sure they're wondering about particular relationships with our partners. Any updates you can give for how Telos's partners are doing there?
I'm sure, Jack, you have a lot of specific updates. I'll say I think the uncertainty that Jack described is sort of endemic. I can say, for my own family, near Bethlehem, it just feels apocalyptic. They may not be sort of in the target of a lot of the strikes, but you know, there was the pandemic, and then there was October 7th and the closure, um, and they don't have shelters. They don't have bomb shelters there. So there's nowhere to run. And then family chat the other day, I was seeing like a crater at Sukkot, which is like sort of a main intersection in Beisachor near Bethlehem, where a missile fragment had fallen, and another one on a school. Thankfully, no one was killed or injured. And meanwhile, the settlements are expanding at an unprecedented rate. On my last visit in December, I was just shocked to see you hear all about sort of the war, first the ongoing genocide in Gaza and then the Iran war, but you don't see what's actually happening on the ground, which is just this massive expansion of Israeli settlement activity everywhere, these pogroms on the roads. So a lot of our partners, whether Palestinian or Israeli, are from what I can gather, all this, half a world away, are really living in this period of extreme darkness and uncertainty. And it doesn't feel like there's a way out. In fact, it feels like we are rushing towards sort of an escalation, even greater than what we see. And so it's dark. And I really appreciated, Ryan, the way that you opened this up by locating us in this moment of Lent, where it's impossible to see, for those of us familiar with that story and who practice Lent. It's impossible almost to see anything past what we're supposed to believe is the finality of it all, in this moment. And I've been in touch with a lot of our partners. We do have a trip on the calendar at the end of May. And part of the reason for that is, despite sort of this uncertainty and the horror of the moment, is to live into the possibility of something else, and to say that, a lot of our partners on the ground have asked for solidarity. They were really disappointed, obviously not with the outbreak of war, but with the fact that we were not able to come and to develop, and deepen a set of relationships that is sustaining, to many of them. And so, on a very practical level, what that looks like, in many communities deeply affected, people don't want to be objects of charity. They have talents, they have energy, they have gifts. They want to use that, and by us showing up, we provide an opportunity for people to do that and to form new relationships and connections with the world. And also, people want a different story to be told out there and recognize that we come from communities here. It's a US-Israeli war on Iran right now. It's not just Israel. What we saw happen and what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank, Jerusalem, was co-sponsored and co-authored in many ways by the US with our weapons, our politics, and whatnot. And so making sure that the reality that there's so many people on the ground who are deeply impacted and want us to live into this as individuals, as communities, as faith communities, as a country differently. They want their stories to be told so that we can change our story. So we have it on the calendar, keeping that spirit of solidarity and recognizing that another way is possible despite all available evidence, and that the only way we get there is by locking arms together, not turning around away from each other. And we may need to postpone again, but we'll see. But yeah, I think that's the challenge of this moment. As difficult as it is to hold on to that core belief that it doesn't have to be like this, and it shouldn't be like this. And perhaps we can find a different way forward together. And I think that's what we're trying to do in this moment.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And I'll just add that the answer to that question really depends on where you are. So I would say our partners in Israel-Palestine and Israel probably have a very similar, you know, life and experience to what I described. But our partners in the West Bank cities, in Palestinian cities like Ramallah, Bethlehem, Hebron, they're living through all this anxiety of entering another forever war of who knows when this whole thing will end and when the world will go back to normal and jobs and so forth. But they also, when Israel intercepts these missiles that are coming through, um, it when it sees that a missile is projected to land in an open area, it doesn't necessarily intercept it. And so, for example, in the city of Hebron just last week, um, there were four women at a salon getting their hair done in preparation for Eid, for celebration of the end of the month of Ramadan and the Muslim holiday of Eid al-Fitr. And they're at this salon. There's no siren, and the missile is projected to land on Hebron, and that's not within Israel's jurisdiction. And so, although it's a densely populated area, it's left to fall, and it falls on the salon and kills four young women that are getting their just prepping for a holiday. And so you also have this very real threat of, and just today, it landed in the courtyard of Birzeit University, just near Ramallah, fragments of a rocket. And so even if you can hear the siren from a nearby settlement, let's say, and you're living in one of the Palestinian cities, there's a good chance that the missile might not be intercepted. You don't have a safe room. Um, and so I would say, doubly scary to be in Palestinian cities right now. Again, and the settler violence that Greg is talking about has exponentially increased over this past, I would even say, year, but over these past 3 years. But I mean, so much so that Israel had largely ignored a lot of the atrocities of that happened in Gaza and that were done in Gaza. But even now, it's increased so much that Israeli activists have been attacked, and other Palestinians have been attacked just these past couple of weeks. That it's actually now been reported on Israeli news. It's gotten so bad. So so folks in the West Bank are really really feeling vulnerable in terms of their future. People don't get on the roads because of the threat of rockets and the threat of being attacked. And so they're not leaving their cities, Palestinian cities like Ramallah and Bethlehem, to go to other Palestinian cities. And so that's creating kind of an enforced closure on these cities without there actually having a physical closure. Just in their minds, people are afraid to leave, and then more and more land is confiscated, whether physically and legally or by force, because of that. So the situation in the West Bank, I would say it's really dire right now. And the more this goes on, folks like us and groups like us are not here to bear witness and share. And I think that's another important piece of the puzzle where people, when groups like us show up, they feel like, okay, at least now folks are seeing it with their own eyes. They could report it back to their friends, to their communities. But when things like this happen and these trips get canceled, they feel like, oh, there's really no hope for us.
I want to add just a couple quick things, Ryan, if I might. Just to put a pin on some of what Jack said, when I was last in Beit Sahur in December, a new settlement was launched just overnight. And Israeli minister came out and hailed this as this new permanent um, um, development. And that was really concerning, I think, to us. It was where the children's hospital was supposed to be in Beit Sahur and a playground. So these are the communities that are no longer available. Um, and, family members, I think, everywhere just expressed to me, people I knew that, that they looked upon Gaza and were worried that they in fact were next and were not driving on these roads. I will say, I don't want to take a turn away from the lament to the hopeful. Um, I have to be honest, like this is not a hopeful comment, but I feel like a complete and utter failure these last years going on in so many ways. And on a personal level, I don't have words for people I know anymore. And I don't even know how to check in or what to say. Like, oh, how are you? And sometimes like Jack's on this call, we have these weird text messages back and forth. It's just to kind of like text with someone. But I think that's where everyone is right now. So I would encourage you, if you do have connections, Palestine, Israel, wherever, just to check in on people, even if it's about something small and seemingly meaningless. Like that's particularly meaningful right now. And I know I get in my whole but I've noticed things changing way too slowly. But just a couple weeks ago, and here in New York City, I was invited to a gathering of about 400 Jewish leaders called Smol Emuni, people who are observant in their faith and are sort of like trying to constitute this religious left. And the conversation was honest. It was fraught at times. And the reception I received there as like a Palestinian, a member of six, on a panel of six was extraordinary. I used some difficult language but I was frank about where we were. And there was movement that I had not seen in these communities in decades of many people starting to recognize that, wait a second, where we're at is a horrible place for all of us. That whether you're Zionist, anti-Zionist, one state, two states, six states, this is heading to a disaster for everyone. And we have to find a way forward that truly centers the value of all human life. And right now, at this particular moment in the Middle East, Palestinian life is particularly fragile and must be protected. Um, and so that was encouraging. Later, I was invited just randomly to Crown Heights in Brooklyn to speak to a group of about 25 Haredi from the Chabad movement, young people who didn't know each other, which was mind-blowing to me. This had and they were curious and they were open. And we see the movement among the right and the left in America right now that's re-examining these questions. Some of this movement, quite frankly, is terrifying. It's not centering the fundamental dignity and rights of everyone, and it's sometimes Islamophobic or actually anti-Semitic, which only serves to entrench injustice in new forms, doesn't serve to heal or liberate us. But people are listening and they're paying attention right now. And so I guess that's where I'm landing. There's so much there aren't words for this moment. And this extends far beyond Israel-Palestine to what's happening in our country. But people are listening and they're paying attention. And I do believe that the majority of good people are not aligned with these powerful forces that are just trying to get more powerful right now. And the fact that people are paying attention should encourage us to show up for each other and to speak up and to believe that right now it seems like we're just headed towards down this horrible precipice. but there is another way, and things will look different one day, especially if we come together and learn how to translate our faith into action. We lost Ryan, I think, our host.
Very sorry. I had some connectivity issues here. I'm back now. Can everyone hear me okay? Sorry for the
Yes.
issues. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm so sorry for the connectivity issue and I'm sorry for the disruption. Maybe, Jack, can we give you a concluding word, maybe something specifically around how to support our neighbors on the ground now during this very difficult time? Greg, thank you. I know that you need to get going to another call, but Greg, thanks for the updates. Thanks also for the invitation just to be in touch with those we know on the ground as a way of sending thoughts of solidarity and support there. Jack?
I really liked what Greg said. I find it really encouraging when people check in and send me messages. Some people might think, they're, oh, what do I send this person that's living through such a difficult period right now? But just receiving a small text is uplifting, and makes you feel like seen and heard, and that someone's thinking about you. In terms of action points, I think there's uh, the feeling here on the ground is that Israel can't really do this without the U.S., without the U.S.'s backing, and Trump and the U.S. is playing a very central role in this issue and this conflict. And so, the more we talk about it, the more we try to get our communities voicing our our opposition to senseless violence and and this war that really, in my view, at least in a lot of others here on the ground, is not going to take us anywhere productive, or that creates security for anyone. And so if we can speak out a little bit more in our communities and not be hesitant to voice our opposition to it, I think it's there's a lot of power in the U.S. Yeah.
Jack, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and for sharing so generously in this conversation that we recognize is overwhelming and is difficult. So thank you. Certainly, in addition to reaching out and offering words of solidarity and support, also taking every opportunity we have to speak up and share our words of opposition because we know that it matters. Thank you again, Jack. Well, hopefully you can stick around for some time of Q&A at the end. At this point, I want to make a segue to our next area on our agenda, which is our new Mosaic program, and specifically our recent pilgrimage through Ireland and Northern Ireland. I apologize if it feels like a quick segue, but as you may know, Mosaic is Telos's new 2-year peacemaking program, which has been designed specifically for pastors and church leaders who are looking for ways to become better equipped to actively engage their congregations in embodied peacemaking in their local communities and their local contexts. This first Mosaic cohort we launched this past September. It includes 13 church leaders from 8 congregations across the US. And at the end of February, our Mosaic cohort participated in Telos's Ireland and Northern Ireland pilgrimage, which included stops in Dublin, Derry, Omagh, and Belfast, where we learned from local clergy, writers, educators, and community leaders on the history of Ireland, including the troubles, the tragic costs of this conflict, the Good Friday Agreement, and ongoing efforts for peacemaking today. And now we're going to hear from a few members of our Mosaic cohort on their experience. And I'd like to invite Andrea first to share. Andrea Ackerman is the pastor of community life at Christ City Church in DC. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me. Thanks to Telos, and hello to you all. Um, yeah, I'm really grateful to be a part of this cohort and to be learning and experiencing these things alongside these other leaders. I was able to, as part of the cohort, we were able to go certainly to Ireland and Northern Ireland, and we also went on Telos's trip, Restory, in the US. I've done a lot of comparing and contrasting, I think, of my experience of those trips, which has helped me process some of it a bit. It's been really interesting, an interesting perspective to be in someone else's mess, as we might say. Though I'll concede that the U.S. is in the U.S. mess is quite large. But being in a context like Ireland and Northern Ireland, to sit in someone else's conflict really gives you perspective on your own. It has done that for me. I've likened it a bit to someone giving me a sphere to hold and say, hold this. I want you to look at it and study it. When it's your own, I think there's a fear of this is going to burn me, or I'm not sure which part of this might break off if I touch it a particular way. And I felt that in Ireland and Northern Ireland, I was able to, someone gave me a sphere to hold and I was able to hold it and look at it, the whole thing. And it gave me perspective on how to look at my own. One of the things that that certainly won't be new to anyone, I don't think, on this call, just is that conflict and peace building and the factors that go into both of those things are both really universal and unique. There were so many times I would be learning something or experiencing something in Northern Ireland, especially, and say, I don't know what this is, but I know what this is. And I think having experiences like that on the trip were both very discouraging. There is just a human tendency to other and divide everywhere all the time. And it was also encouraging. You see folks, you're meeting folks who are putting their best efforts towards building peace. And towards human flourishing for themselves and for their neighbors. One of the big contrasts I held and was able to, I think, really just think through a bit more, and especially since I've been back, is the siblinghood of all the isms, I think, the dividing isms. So in just very general terms, a big ism in the United States would be racism. In Northern Ireland and Ireland, that would be sectarianism. Recognizing the siblinghood of those two things, again, gave me just a really different kind of perspective on how to even interrogate myself as I work towards peace in my neighborhood, in my context, to recognize, again, I don't know what this is, but I know what this is. And there's something for me to attend here, even if it's not familiar to me in this context. There's something very familiar in my own context. I think one of the surprising things, particularly in Belfast, when we spent a lot of our time in Belfast, the continued segregation of people in the city of Belfast was surprising to me. The presence of gates and gates that still open and close in the morning and at night. The segregated school system, I felt, was a surprising fact to learn. I think being in a place where there is very close proximity to your neighbor, but still very explicit division. Again, you can just feel it as someone who's coming in as an outsider. And I think it's really encouraged. I think we had a lot of conversations around this, around identity and the way that identity, when that gets threatened in any way, you tend towards self-protection and self-preservation. Fear is just a tricky little booger that is used to divide and used to control, and is quite the opposite of peace building. So I think I've been reminded a lot on this trip for myself of what neighboring looks like, what identity work looks like, and that peace building truly is seed planting work. It is slow often. It is quite hidden often. We do not receive a promise to see the fruit all the time, and that's tough. But I'm really grateful to have been able to learn in this way in other contexts, and continue cultivating imagination for peace building.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing, Andrea, and especially appreciate you naming that relationship between the isms, as you say, the siblinghood. That's really helpful language of racism, which is so prevalent here, but sectarianism there. How are they connected, and how can we learn from one another in this slow work, as you say? Thank you. Well, next up, we'll hear from Mike Rigdon. Mike's the elder and family pastor at Redemption Church in Costa Mesa, California. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Ryan. Hi, everybody. Yeah, it's just a real honor to be with you all. To even just share, I'm still in the place of process. And I guess the best place for me to kind of jump off here and start is to share a little bit about how timely the cohort has been for me. So this year I'm entering into 20 years of church ministry. And I remember like last January, before I had even heard about the cohort and before I even was an opportunity to apply, I feel like something that the Lord had put on my heart was to be praying for a tender heart. Because 20 years in church ministry, for those that are familiar with that, it can be pretty discouraging. There could be a lot of hopelessness, a lot of wrestling with is the church really bringing hope into the world? Is the church really a city on a hill? Are we really a light? Like, what difference is this really making? And I put that prayer out to the Lord to say, like, in order for me, I feel called to this to keep going. I need a tender heart. Like, I need to find pockets of hope. I need to see like where the kingdom of God is breaking in so many different ways. And so I guess just fast forwarding to the cohort, as I'm reflecting back and have been reflecting back, this has been the answer of a prayer. So I'm still in this. I'm coming to you all today with a very full head, still kind of trying to process all that we experienced and who we talked to, and then a very heavy heart, even coming into this space, but then even just getting the updates and still taking in what's going on around the world. But I think what I want to share with you all, and kind of the conversation that I have been coming back to, and has really just been kind of fueled a lot of different conversations and directions that we're taking here as a church in Costa Mesa and Orange County, and trying to pay attention to the conflict, is a conversation that we had with Father McGill and Reverend Steve Stockman in Belfast, who a Catholic priest and a Protestant Reverend are committed to friendship together in Belfast, and had started an organization called uh, My Four Corners, I believe it's called, and they have Four Corners Festival. And the idea of bringing people together, having people leave their own corner of comfort and leave that corner and journey and venture out to another corner and build relationships and creating opportunities. They use the word friendship. Idea of like leave your politics at home and become friends, understand the other, get to know someone that you might not interact with. And so that idea of what they're about and the festival and how that actually unifies people and bring people together. And so hearing them share about that, but being more struck with their friendship and how they felt like polar opposites in every single way. And their commitment as clergy in the city to actually work together for the benefit of the city, not for the building or growth of their own church, just to see mutual flourishing happening in a city that, as Andrea was talking about, where the divides are very clear, right? And that was one of those moments where there was like, oh, there is hope. Like there is something. The kingdom of God is breaking in. There are people that are stepping out into these areas, and this is worth it. And I can remember like just hearing them share and being in that moment. And it was, I think, pretty much during that day where like our phone started pinging, and that was when like the war in Iran was breaking out, and we're at least getting breaking news. I think it was the same day that the bomb hit the school. And there was that moment of, here we are talking about conflict, and this is happening, right? So there was just this weird, like, we're talking about a conflict that's kind of it's going on still, but there's this big conflict also breaking out. And Reverend Stockman kind of just stopped. There was a question that was posed, and he stopped in that moment and kind of just started pleading, basically, and talking about, I think he said, I wrote it down, like, our conflict doesn't affect you all back in the States, but the conflict that you have with the world affects us greatly. And there was that shift of in my mind of I'm here to learn about a conflict out there, but there had been like a detachment a little bit in my approach of what conflict actually am I participating in due to proximity, and this level of ownership of I'm a part of the conflict. Like, and for me that has been something that I am constantly coming back to, and conversations that we're having with our church right now in Orange County can feel kind of like a one space, but all the cities are very, very different and have their own challenges and have their own conflicts. And so just like the question, like, what are the conflicts in my own city? Like, do we have even eyes to see that? Are our ears even open to know that? What's the conflict in our county? What is the conflict happening in your own neighborhood right now? And just being able to like I ask that question, wrestle with it, process with it, identify it, and then shift to like what challenges am I experiencing to actually bring peace into those spaces? What fears are there? And I think that was one of the big things that we were learning from Father McGill and Reverend Stockman was just overcoming fear in those spaces and being willing to step in and insert ourselves in the middle of something that might feel really complicated. And then just like the last forms of reflection that they provided and just gave some clear language. And these are questions that I've written down and are wrestling within our community. What does it look like to create space for peacemaking? And that has caused a lot of reflection of all the different spaces that we were in as a cohort in Northern Ireland, the different rooms, the different ways that things were set up. But like the space was essential to that. The space is essential for us to create an environment for friendship, for dialogue, to disagree, to listen, whatever that might be. And so, what does that look like to create space? And so, yeah, I think like that's kind of what's on my heart and what I want to share. And I think it's been really, really challenging for us here in Orange County, even with immigration going on. And so, yeah, I think that's what I have to share. And I went over 5 minutes, I think. Sorry, Ryan.
Thanks so much for sharing, Mike, and a special thanks for starting with your prayer and your vulnerability in that way for a tender heart, and how this experience is informing a response for you there around taking seriously the challenges and the conflicts in your own community and the opportunity we have before us to offer something different, maybe even starting with friendship. Thank you. Well, up next, we'll hear from Alan. Alan Thomas is the senior pastor of Outer West Church in San Antonio, Texas. Alan, thanks for sharing with us today.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, thanks everyone for taking a few minutes to listen. The trip was incredible. The Telos team, from Ryan to Todd to Marion, were incredible, and I think lots of meaningful relationships being built between the team. I think in my reflection, some of the themes similar to what my friends have said already, but the two words that have stuck with me from the beginning of this Mosaic program has been proximity and presence. And I'll share a personal story and then kind of tie that into my Telos experience so far. I remember being a teenager growing up in New York and walking through a grocery store. And I remember getting to this aisle, and at the end of the aisle, opposite end of the aisle, I see this older man. And he was walking with his son with Down syndrome. And they were on one side of the aisle, I was on the other, and they were walking towards me. And I remember in that moment, I turned around and walked into the other aisle. And as a teenager, I was genuinely nervous about interacting with someone with Down syndrome, because most of my experiences of that community came from people that made fun of folks. I remember always casually using the R word growing up, movies that reduced them to like entertainment and not as human beings. And in fact, I've never had a conversation with a person with Down syndrome before. And so I was afraid of what that interaction would be like. And so I avoided him. Fast forward 15 years later, my wife and I have our first child who's born with Down syndrome, and he's changed our world. He's changed our family dynamics. Empathy is a core value for his sisters because of who he is. Our church has a special needs community that's thriving. People that never have would have stepped foot in a church have because of that ministry, and a lot of that goes back to him and his story. And so proximity and presence are themes there because and in some ways for us it was forced proximity. Like we didn't choose to have a son with Down syndrome, but we were given the honor of raising this beautiful child through all of his complexities. And if I'm 100% honest with you, if Ezra was not born with Down syndrome, I would not have proximity to that community at this level. In fact, I probably would not care about the special needs community as much as I do today. And I can pretty confidently say that our church would not have a thriving special needs community had it not been for that proximity. So as I think about our Mosaic program, going back to the Restore US trip, to the Ireland trip, the theme has been proximity and presence with the other. I remember us sitting down with a British Protestant man, Alan, who had lost his wife due to an IRA bombing, and he was sitting across an Irish Catholic woman whose son was murdered by the British and sharing their stories. And at one point, as she was reciting this beautiful poem about her son, she was crying. I saw him put his arms on her leg to console her, and I think that touch visibly symbolizes that proximity and presence, seeing others in their humanity and hearing their humanity through these stories. We also saw IRA members and British paramilitary members sit with one another to work towards peacemaking, and that was beautiful. But none of that happens without proximity and presence. And I think we live in a world and a context where you don't actually have to have proximity, especially here in the United States. You get to sit behind social media and justify a war in which children are being killed around the world, and it is a sense of privilege. And so, for us to be peacemakers, this has been one of the reflections for me. Is I think we have to learn to be in proximity with the other, and it should start in our own context, as Mike mentioned, in our own neighborhoods and our own families. As I mentioned, we had proximity that was forced to the special needs community, but it has spurred me to consider like what other communities, what other neighbors, what other spaces am I distant from simply because I don't have proximity, and what am I missing because of that? Karen Campbell, who's one of our facilitators, she shared this text explaining how sectarianism begins. And she said it begins by saying we're different, so we believe different. And then you say we are right. And then you say we are right, so you must be wrong. And then you say you must be a less adequate version of what we are. And then it leads to you are not what you say you are. We are, in fact, what you say you are, which leads to what you are doing is evil, which leads to you are wrong. So you are so wrong that you forfeit ordinary rights, which leads to you are less than human, which leads to you are evil, which leads to you are demonic. And so this ladder that people work themselves through, and I think to work our way back up that ladder towards peacemaking, proximity and presence with the other is essential. And so these trips have given me a totally different lens, one tied to my story, but also to the people that I see now. And I'll end with saying this. I grew up in a Muslim community, not because I was Muslim, but all of my friends were from Pakistan and India. And in fact, I spent lots of time in mosques growing up. And there was a period of my life where I considered the teachings of Islam. And I had lost a lot of those friendships over time, but I still follow some of those guys on social media. And here I am a pastor in 2026. I see one of those guys posting on social media about what's happening in Iran, and specifically with his concern that it's tied to, the US agenda is tied to the teachings of Jesus. And because of this kind of new lens of peacemaking and seeing the other and being in proximity to the other, I engaged with him and we were able to have this healthy dialogue around both of our faiths and how people oftentimes misrepresent both sides of it. And so I think these trips with Telos, especially the Ireland trip, has helped me to approach these conversations in a healthier way. And my hope is that not just for myself, but our church community can move into being in proximity and being with people that are they're often distant from. So that's been one of my big takeaways, proximity and presence.
Thanks so much for sharing those reflections, Alan, and especially thinking about that invitation to take proximity seriously, again, in our own context, and maybe even taking steps to move out of our comfort zone in order to do that. So thank you very much. Well, we're joined also by Todd Deathridge, Telos co-founder and executive director, who has been on this trip several times and who was with our Mosaic cohort. Todd, what would you like to share on this conversation?
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks everybody for being on. I really have appreciated this conversation today. I'll be quick because I know we need to get to questions. But there was some key takeaways for me from this trip, and one of them came at the very end, and we met with a Protestant man named Alan, whose wife was killed in an IRA bombing, and a Catholic mother named Linda, whose son was killed by a kind of a gang, a Protestant or loyalist gang back during the Troubles, and it was an important reminder of the trail of violence. We had also met with a veterans group, former UK soldiers former IRA fighters, former loyalist paramilitary fighters, and who all come together to argue for reconciliation work now. And one of them said, that no matter what the political or other objectives you have, the trail of violence is long, and it generally makes it not worth it. And so I can never fully, even as a peacemaker, I'm fully committed to nonviolence, and at the same time, I can never fully work myself to a pacifist position and stay comfortably there. But I think even, I honor those who do, and I really respect that. But I also know that I don't think those of us who aren't pacifists are ever really appreciative enough of the limits of violence to achieve good things. It's more of the same. This is how we stay trapped. And by that I mean all the kinds of violence, the violence of war, the violence of terrorism, the violence of systems of control like occupation and all those sorts of things, and the violence of even of culture and language, racism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and all the things that dehumanize people. And so sitting there with these people who've paid this price and they're doing this reconciliation work, it was such a familiar story. And at the end of it all, Linda, the mother, starts rummaging around in her purse to try to find a poem that she'd written about her son. And it just broke me completely open, because I've seen that exact same scene so many times before. One of my dearest friends is an Israeli mother whose son was killed by a Palestinian sniper named her name is Robbie Damlin. And Robbie, I've seen her rummage around in her purse before to pull out the letter that she's written to her son. And I thought of a Palestinian mother named Layla from Bethlehem who lost a baby at a checkpoint and couldn't get to health care. And I thought of our friend Mama Callie in Selma, Alabama, who has lost a son to gun violence and a daughter to a really broken American healthcare system. And these mothers bear so much of the weight of the violence. And so we just really have to be so much more brutally honest with ourselves as we, because I'm seeing people cheerleading war and violence in all directions and blessing bombs, it's disgusting on one level, but it's so deeply malformed on another. And so I think that those just seeing those faces of the tail end of all of this, and see how not only how counterproductive it is, but just how morally wrong it is, was just a reminder all over again of why this work is so important. I'm so glad to have this conversation today. So thank you.
Todd, thank you so much for sharing and for that reminder of the long tail of violence, but so poignantly with these very vivid pictures. If you haven't already read Todd's reflections on those stories on the Telos Substack, I highly recommend you check it out, The Long Trail of Violence. Well, we have a few minutes left on our call. Out of respect for those who shared, I will ask that if you have a question, you frame it as a question rather than a comment at this point for the sake of time. But if you have questions, please feel free to drop those into chat, and we'd love to take a couple before we wrap up here. Thanks for dropping the link to that reflection in the chat so everyone can read it, Rebecca. Well, what questions do you have as we get to the end of this time? Christine, I see your question here. I'll go ahead and read it aloud. How does Telos articulate the opposite definitions of the same word, quote, neighbor? One, biblically defined as the person completely different, another, and two, the common definition that Christians use, like the art of neighboring, that in most cases is the person who's similar to me, quote, birds of a feather flock together. The word neighbor seems rather problematic in colloquial use, as it doesn't seem to reflect and represent Jesus's definition. Yeah, so how do we distinguish that biblically from maybe more of an informal use of the word neighbor? Todd, I'm curious, is this one that you'd like to take?
Sure. Since Telos is the question is of what is the kind of Telos view of this? I don't know. I mean, I won't speak for the Telos view, I'll speak more for my own, but I think Jesus himself gave Christians at least a way to think about that, because this question was asked directly of him, who is my neighbor? And it was not that soft definition of the person who's most like me, or even the person who lives next door, it's such a broad definition that it includes the people that are most unlike me and the people that I might even consider my enemy. And so, and as he said in other places, anybody can love the people who do nice things to you, but it's the harder work is to actually understand that you are deeply interconnected with people who even are not your friend and are not like you, but your flourishing is actually directly tied to theirs. That interconnected reality that Dr. King spoke so eloquently about, I think, gets more at that.
Yeah, thank you. And certainly that biblical story concludes with the question, who was a neighbor? The one who showed mercy. Go and do likewise. So as much as we're trying to define those terms, I think the invitation is perhaps even more important. The one who showed mercy. Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Todd. Maybe one more question before we conclude with some invitations into peacemaking. Certainly a lot to take in. Please do add your question in the chat if you have a pressing question. Someone did ask if we'll share the recording afterward for those who couldn't make it, or maybe if you joined late, we will be sharing the recording out. So if you're not already signed up for the Telos newsletter, there's even more reason to do so now.
I would say one more thing, that if there's not another question, I think it's a really good reminder from this last trip as well. When things are so difficult and dark as they are right now, it can seem not just naive, but kind of ridiculous and silly to try to create some sense of possibility. And yet it is really important that we not give up on the possibility of a different future and a different world that we're going to have to work really hard for, but to lean into that work of creating moral imagination by doing the right things and meet the moment in that way. But one of the things that struck me on this trip, it was someone said something like, if you'd gone back to the early 1990s, the Northern Ireland conflict seemed the world's most intractable, because Mandela had been freed from prison in South Africa. And the Israelis and Palestinians had signed the Oslo Accords, and there was a view that these kind of three really intractable systems were breaking apart, except for Northern Ireland, and it was still very stuck. And so it seemed the most. And today, they have a lot of work to do in terms of reconciliation there, but they have a political agreement that has held for 28 years now, and that's really important. And so it is important to remember that even when things look really, really incredibly difficult and dark, does not mean there's not really important things to do and work to be done and possibility that may be there for us to lean into. So that was such a good reminder for me to think about what it was like, in the early 90s when you're in Northern Ireland and you see the other things are happening and you are so stuck and still trapped in all of this systemic injustice and the violence and all of the stuff that was going on. I thought that was a good word.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that reminder, Todd. Even in the last 30 years, what was deemed intractable conflict has changed. Yeah. Well, thank you for your questions. Thanks for your comments. As we wrap up, we want to emphasize the fact that here at Telos, we are committed to embodying peacemaking, not just speaking about peacemaking. And so we'd like to conclude with a few invitations on ways to get involved with Telos and Mosaic's peacemaking work. We can go ahead and pull the slides back up if you don't mind doing so, Rebecca. Several ways to do just that, starting with an invitation to take part in the Red Candle campaign as part of your Easter programming. If you've been familiar with the Red Candle campaign, we're going to continue doing that through Easter. So we'll include a resource to do that in the chat that you can download and use in your local congregation. We'd also like to invite you to apply to join our next Mosaic cohort. If you're a pastor, if you're a Christian leader of a congregation, or if not, please do share the program with someone who would make a good fit. The application window for Mosaic is going to open up next month in April. We'd love to hear from you. We're planning on making selections for our second cohort in June, and you can find the application linked in the chat. We also want to extend an invitation to all of you to make plans to join our Christian Leaders Gathering. That's going to be happening in DC this June, June 10th through 12th, and you can register today at the link we'll share with you in the chat. And of course, if you haven't already done so, please do sign up for Telos's Christian Engagement newsletter as well as a way to stay in touch with all of the different ways that we are inviting you and others to step into this work of peacemaking with your community. I do want to say a special thank you to all of you for taking the time to join us today. And of course, a deep, deep thank you for all of today's presenters for sharing your time, for sharing your vulnerability, your stories with us. We are profoundly grateful for it. And we look forward to seeing all of you at a future Telos gathering. On behalf of everyone here at Telos, may peace be with you and may it move through you. Be well. Thank you.